Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Alicia Hollinger, and I'm the Executive Director, VP for ICF Thought Leadership Institute, one of the new 6 family organizations that was established in 2020 as under the International Coaching Federation. So here at the Institute, our mission is to show how coaching contributes to prosperity, peace, and partnerships for people and planet in a sustainable way. And that's part of the overarching framework for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we are gathered here today for our convening on manifesting the future of education with the intention to think, learn, and transcend. So we have invited you as a wisdom weaver or a global thinker to share your insights, stories, and expertise on the topic. And so for us, wisdom weaving is a practice that links together unique, diverse perspectives into a nice, complex, harmonious whole. And we definitely have a diverse group here today. So on behalf of the board of directors, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and your commitment to transforming education so we have access to quality education for all. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our volunteer leaders who participated on the task force to help make this convening come together. Jose, Miriam, Karen, and is Les on the phone. I haven't seen him on the Zoom room. I haven't seen him yet, but he might be joining us. So thank you so much for your contribution. We'll go ahead and get started. And as we enter our space today, let's just take a few seconds to reflect and enter this space with an intention. So I invite each of you to set an intention. What is it that you want to manifest here today? One word. And I guess for those who might be a little bit verbose, 2 or 3 words might be just fine, but go ahead and put your intention in the chat box. Understanding, connections, engage, share, innovation, learn, open, beyond mere education, collaboration, network, share and learn, co-construction, connect. Wonderful. These are some amazing intentions, and we're really setting the energy for our discussion today. So let's manifest these intentions together. My role is the facilitator. So I'm here to be fully present and to create a space that allows you to show up with your authentic self to the table so you can engage in discussion while being open and listening to others. And I'm here in the United States in Washington, D.C. I'm a sociologist, so I look at the world through interactions, relationships, and processes. And my passion to make the world a better place has led me to study social change models. So I would like to add to the list of intentions that we have a little bit of fun. And during my meditation this morning, the 4 elements came to me thinking about this conversation, thinking about the earth element and what grounds us in this conversation today. And then the fire element, sparking our imagination, the water element being open and just letting things flow and emerge through this discussion. And then air element, just being open and taking flight and really lifting off and opening up our imaginations. So those were the things that came to me today as I thought about our discussion. So we'll go ahead and jump into the agenda. We'll start off with 3 speakers. The first speaker will talk about the next generation of schools looking at K through 12. Then we'll move on to the realities of digital transformation in education, and then end with lifelong learning and self-actualization in work and the future. So with that, and then after the three speakers, we'll get into small breakout groups to reflect on the discussion that was presented to us through the talks. And then we'll come back together as a large group to dig in deeper. So I'll go ahead and introduce the first speaker. Ali-Pekka Hanan became the 8th Director General of the International Baccalaureate Organization in May of 2021. Prior to joining the International Baccalaureate, Ali-Pekka was Director General of the Finnish National Agency for Education. Ali-Pekka had an active career in politics in Finland. He was Minister of Education and Science, Minister of Transport and Communication, and a Member of Parliament. Ali-Pekka was Director of IL, the Finnish National Public Broadcasting Company, before joining the Finnish Prime Minister's office as State Secretary. He has also been responsible as State Secretary for the portfolios of the Ministry of Education and Culture, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Development, and then as State Secretary at the Ministry of Finance of Finland. Ali-Pekka holds a Master of Laws from the University of Helsinki in Finland and has been awarded an honorary doctorate by the Faculty of Education and Psychology at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. He is married and he has 3 children. So we'll welcome Ali-Pekka, and I am going to pull up his presentation.
Thank you, Alicia. And it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to share ideas about the schools for the next generation, the K-12. And kind of, I would like to start by saying that how I see that what learning and education is, and what do I mean with those kind of basic terms. To me, learning is an interrelationship between an individual and the world. It's the process how we adapt to the world, and education has a third component. It's a triangle. There is the learner, there's the world, and then there is somebody who is trying to help that learning to happen, and also to bring into the values of the societies where the learning and education happens. So thinking about education, a very important question is that what sort is the world where we're living right now? And if we go to the next picture, one way of looking at that question of what's the world like today is to look at what are the challenges that we have ahead of us. I like this picture which describes the challenges ahead of us for the reason that it shows that the challenges that we're faced with are a bit different than what the earlier challenges have been, for the reason that they are not, it's not possible to tackle those challenges by the elite, only by the few people, the leaders or the scientists or the innovators or some high companies giving us solutions. But what's typical to the challenges that we're faced with is that they all require our public engagement and engagement of everybody. And that brings me to the kind of idea that how important it really is to be able to create an education system for the young generations which combine the values of quality and equality. Both taking care of that everybody has the possibility to enter the education system, and at the same time that what happens in those schools is of high quality. We have a lot of international surveys which show that in many, many countries, it's about 50% of the population going to school that after 5 to 6 years of education don't know the basic questions of literacy or mathematics. So it's not enough to get children to school, but it's to question that how can we assure that the learning really happens. There's two meta tasks of education. The first one being the challenge to transfer everything that we as humans have been able to achieve so far to the new generations. All the culture, science, everything that we have been able to create as humans. And the other task is to give the capabilities and competencies for the new generations to create their own future, their own path in their lives. And when we lived in a world where the change was more linear in type, there were less complexity and there was more possibilities for anticipating what will happen next and with the new generations. When we took care of the transfer task, we kind of automatically took care also about giving the capabilities to build the future for the new generations. It was kind of occupations were kind of inherited from fathers to sons, mothers to daughters. But in today's world, that's not the case. We cannot anticipate what are the challenges that the new generations are faced with. So we have to separately tackle also the other meta task of education. And that brings us to the area of kind of giving competencies to the new generations. Going to the next slide, one way of looking at education and the new challenges is to see that what are the societal phases that we are living in. We all know the kind of change from the factories, the industrial society, where us humans were connected to the machines, were part of the machine, and it was kind of the bodily power that was central in our kind of input in the system. Moving from factories to offices, where we were not anymore connected to machines, but we were connected to the chairs, where we learned to sit down all day long. And it was the cognitive part that was important at that time, our ability to deal with information and mold that information for useful purposes. And then there's the question that what's the next kind of level of society that we're faced with? And I see that we are in the phase of moving into an interaction society, where we have actually, for example, artificial intelligence that is much, much better in dealing with the kind of cognitive challenges that we have as humans done earlier. Much more reliable and much more faster than us. And that leads us to the question that what is it there for us humans to do? And to me, the answer is that it is really what is central in being human that becomes our main task. And that's our ability to see what's meaningful in life. to see the ethical considerations and evaluations that we are having, and also connecting with others, being able to utilize each other's strengths for the best of the world. So it is kind of, if it was kind of body in the industrial society, and if it was the head in the information society, then it's really the heart in the interaction society that becomes important. And I'm not saying that the body and brains wouldn't be important in the future. They will, but it's the question that how can we utilize and integrate the use of all of these three elements in everything what we do. And that leads me to the next picture, which is kind of one way of looking at what are the kind of major tasks of an education system. We also in the future, we need to give the young generation the knowledge base to build on. The traditional subjects, but more also the interdisciplinary knowledge bases and understanding what knowledge is all about. It's not enough to have that knowledge, but what becomes more and more important is that what you can do with what you know, the ability to act, and actually by acting also learn new things. When we're talking about kind of deep learning, when we act what we know, that learning becomes part of our identity. And I think that's not only something that usually it's talked when we're discussing vocational education and training, but I would say that this is something that definitely also in the academic and university sector is something that we will be seeing. And then there is the third component, which is the valuing. The question that how do we know and act in a way that is sustainable for the future? And when all of these three areas are well mastered, there is the possibility for us really to be attuned with the world, to change with the world together, and be able to connect our individual well-being to the well-being of the planetary flourishing. So I see that kind of flourishing both on the individual level, society level, and planetary level is something that should be the aim of our education systems. And then going to the next picture, there isn't any kind of one way of creating an education system. The OECD created a very nice study on scenarios for education and schooling. And these 4 scenarios were described in that paper, which I strongly support you to read. And it's the question, all of these kind of 4 scenarios where, for example, technology plays a bit a different role, and the profession of a teacher has a different role also. They are possible, but it's the values again that matter, that which one of these in different nations and internationally we're choosing. My last picture is the picture which I think that is really the big question for national and international education systems. We know how to create high quality classrooms. We know how to create high quality schools, but it is very challenging to create high quality, evolving education and learning systems where all the schools are good schools. And that's something we should aim at. This is an illustration of a work that was done together with OECD, with NCEE, and 5 OECD countries that were the top performers in PISA comparisons. And what it shows is that to be a highly functioning education system, there must be the kind of whole system, and the different elements must be developed together. So it's not enough only to take care of teacher training or take care of early childhood education, but you must have all the different components needed and the different layers that are responsible for providing the education, working in collaboration to create a good learning system, and having learning and the pupil and student in the center. That's what I see is the huge challenge that we are faced with K-12 education. Thank you.
Thank you, Olli-Pekka. And we'll go ahead and pick up on the second speaker, Noah Sobey. Dr. Noah Sobey is Senior Project Officer on the Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO in Paris, where he recently assisted with the research and drafting of UNESCO's new flagship report on the futures of education, entitled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And just as a side, that report actually has been some of the inspiration for this convening today, since the report did call for collaboration. So this convening, in a way, is a response to that call for collaboration to join in on the conversation. Noah is at UNESCO while on extended leave of absence from his faculty position as a professor at Loyola University Chicago. He is also past president of the Comparative and International Education Society and the editor of the journal European Education. Noah?
Thanks very much, Alicia, for that introduction. And it's great to be here. It's wonderful to follow you, Ollie. I think there's a huge number of points of overlap and synergy between what you were presenting. I mean, the importance of values, the importance of thinking about our purposes, and also, as Alicia mentioned, the real urgency of working in collaboration are things that are front and central in this UNESCO project that I've been involved with for the past 3 years, a report titled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. So what I'm going to do is talk very briefly about some of the orienting frameworks and recommendations that come out of that report, because I think they'll be useful for when I go into more detail as asked on the digital transformation of education in that dimension. Let me start with the overarching argument of the report. And if you want to get a copy, I can put a link in the chat afterwards. If you Google UNESCO Futures of Education, you'll come to it, or if you scan that QR code, you'll get to it. But I think it was distributed in the materials for this. But so the overarching argument of the report begins with the realization that many of us are increasingly aware that we're at a turning point. If we're honest with ourselves, we also know that doing more of the same, even if faster, even if more efficiently, is propelling us towards a cliff. It's simply not sustainable, either in terms of our relationships with the living planet Earth or our relationships with one another, both within and across countries, for us to continue as we are. So we face a choice. We can continue on an unsustainable path, or we can radically change course. Now, we know that education has great power to bring about change. We know that knowledge and learning are essential for any social transformation. But at present, the ways we organize education do not do enough to ensure justice, peace, and a healthy planet. And in fact, some of our difficulties stem from how we educate. So the primary argument of this new report is that we need a new social contract for education that can both repair past injustices while transforming the future. So I'll go into a little bit of detail on this, but first, a quick word on how this was prepared. I think I see some names in the room that I recognize from participation in focus groups and discussions. So the report, which is an independent report, was prepared by an international commission on the futures of education that was chaired by the president of Ethiopia, Her Excellency Madam Sahle-Work Zewde. She was joined by 17 other global thought leaders from different areas and different parts of the world. So they composed an international commission that authored the report, but and crucially, with the input, with the ideas, the hopes, and fears of over 1 million people worldwide who joined and engaged during the 2-year preparation process. That included focus groups, that included online platforms, webinars, background papers, a whole extensive engagement that is actually still ongoing as we roll out the report. And I'll say more about that at the end. It's perhaps useful, and Ali did some of this, covered some of this already, to begin with kind of an assessment of where we are. On the one hand, long-term trends show that we have actually come a long way in education in terms of access, in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of gender equality. But of course, that progress has been very uneven. And many of today's gaps are based on yesterday's exclusions and injustices. 1 in 5 children today in low-income countries, 1 in 10 across the world are still out of school. Ali usefully mentioned that, you can create systems that have great schools, but that doesn't mean you're creating great education systems. So there's a lot of work to do to even meet the past promises of education. What we have looked to education to accomplish in the past. And of course, I don't need to tell you that the COVID pandemic has really exacerbated these challenges and the inequalities that we face around the globe. So as if that weren't enough, of course, we also are amidst a number of emerging disruptions and real uncertainties about the future. The planet is in peril, but of course, at the same time, there's great momentum to heal it. Democratic governance is under attack, but at the same time, activism and citizen participation is growing. Ensuring a human-centered world of work is getting harder, but at the same time, more attention in many places is being paid to purpose and to work that matters. And then finally, as I'll go into more detail later on, digital technologies have great potential, but they don't always deliver on their promises. So these are all emerging disruptions. They are the known unknowns. And what's unknown about them is the direction that they'll head. I would submit, and this is a position strongly taken by the UNESCO report, that our task is not simply to respond, but to shape the direction of these uncertain changes, of these transformations. In other words, it's really important to think of education both as adapting and adjusting to a changed world, but also actively striving to shape and change the world. The final thing I want to mention that I think is very important framing of this report and perhaps useful when I get into the digital technology, this I think connects very closely with a number of things Ali was mentioning. Across so many of the conversations that we had, the Commission had in trying to mobilize a global discussion about futures of education, we heard repeatedly the concern of many people that things feel out of balance right now, that there's a real need for us to relearn our interdependencies, to rebalance our relationships with each other, with the living planet Earth and with technology. So, finding that balance, I think, is very much takes us into questions about what it means to be human and how we want to express our humanity, and maybe even how we want to improve our humanity. The call in the report is to build a new social contract for education. This is something that's going to require ongoing collaboration. It's not something that's one and done. I think we all know from working in many cases on this call, decades in the field of education, that this will always be an ongoing process. There's not going to be a magic bullet solution that's going to solve and position us for the future. But just as our anticipation of the future changes, our what we commit to, how we work together in education is going to need to change. So to begin some of the real extensive cultural, social changes that are needed, the Commission focused on 5 areas of education, 5 dimensions. Each of these is the subject of a detailed chapter in the report with very specific recommendations that actually get quite granular. But to quickly recap, in pedagogy, so thinking about, as Ali was talking about, learning as a set of, and education as a set of relationships between a learner, knowledge, competencies, the world, and a teacher. There is in many places in the world a real focus on teacher-driven lessons, despite the fact that we bring groups of learners together into the same spaces. Our efforts are largely directed at individual accomplishment. And the report, the Commission proposes that in a new social contract for education, pedagogy needs to be organized around principles of cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity. Now, in many places today in the world, curricula are organized as a kind of bureaucratic grid of subjects. And the call here is to shift to an emphasis on ecological, intercultural, interdisciplinary learning. And if you stop and think about it, what ties those 3 things together is an invitation for us to think more in terms of connections than in terms of categories. In many parts of the world, teaching is considered an individualized practice, something that occurs behind a classroom door. And the call in this report is to increasingly professionalize teaching as a collaborative endeavor, where the autonomy and the freedom of teachers is supported and they become valued participants in public debates on the futures of education. As for all of us, the experience of the COVID disruption forced the Commission and everyone involved in this project to give a lot of thought to the school, what we learned by the absence and closure of the school. We know that as the school became a global institution across the 20th century, a universal model and universal procedural norms were imposed, not always with the right kind of localization and sensitivity to different contexts. However, the Commission and this report strongly feels that the school as a place that brings people together to learn with and from others is something that needs to be protected and safeguarded, even as it needs to be transformed, reimagined in diverse ways. And finally, when we consider the broader educational ecosystems, we need to ensure that in addition to schools, we're thinking, and educational and training organizations, we're thinking about welcoming and expanding learning opportunities in all social and cultural spaces. So I think this aligns very closely with what Ali laid out about the necessity to think holistically and kind of to tackle the whole set of elements that go into education at the same time. Let me now go into what I'm supposed to talk about, which is the digital transformation of education, which I wanted to plug into that because I wanted to basically begin by recognizing that The accelerating transformation of our societies by digitalization, by digital technologies, is of course reshaping how we learn, how we live. The digital technologies, particularly ones focused on enhancing connectivity, really can enrich educational processes, can improve learning outcomes. They can be bent in the direction of supporting human rights, of enhancing human capabilities, also of facilitating collective action in the directions of peace, justice, and sustainability. But we clearly have not yet fully delivered on many of these promises. And in fact, too often, the digital drives us apart instead of bringing us together. So the first thing I want to just point out is that this contradiction is in fact no different than the contradiction that we've experienced at other great moments of technological change, be that the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, where major collective gains also come with worrisome increases in inequality and exclusion. Ensuring the proper rollout is something that takes time and deliberate attention. When we look to the future, and I think it's important. I mean, it's of course famously difficult to talk about technological trends. More difficult than talking about trends in other domains. But I still think it's possible to identify some of the emerging disruptions that again we both need to react and adapt to and try to steer. The first of these is a pretty significant transformation in human meaning making. The data that can emerge from digital processes, the increasing ability that we have to store, to transmit and search information gives us vast new computational powers. And obviously that comes with considerable risk. And one of those risks is that it can sideline other ways of knowing, for example, indigenous or low tech, the ephemeral, the spiritual, non-commoditized forms of knowledge. So in the ongoing, in our attention to the ongoing transformation of human meaning making, we need to attend to that. The second disruption that I think is important for us to pay attention to is the substitution of machines for human decision making. We're seeing across many sectors, and education is part of this, an expanded use of algorithmic machine learning techniques that are really entering into the terrain of social and political decision making, and in some cases replacing human judgment. To an extent, we're all aware that bias and subjectivity might be able to be controlled by technological processes that have transparency. Yet we also at the same time know that those processes can be veiled in secrecy and complexity, and can in fact reinforce the very biases that we're trying to overcome. The possible erosion of intellectual and personal freedom, the ways that certain forms of digital technology lend themselves to surveillance and control, creates considerable room for abuse. And as we look to the future, that's something we should be paying great attention to. Right now, digital platforms in education are really quite linked to commercial interests and advanced purposes linked to the broader business objectives of their providers. Now, there's a strong movement in the UNESCO and across other organizations as well, including the OECD, to build robust public infrastructure, open educational resources. So I think, again, this is an area of emerging disruption where it's in our hands to steer. Finally, I think the displacement of social, political, cultural, economic, even interpersonal life into virtual spaces raises some profound questions about what it means to be human and what our core approaches to teaching and learning need to be. So how do we respond to this? I'm going to talk about quickly about recommendations in three areas. The first of which is ensuring that digital technology actually empowers and connects. We can do this by focusing on supporting learner well-being, by making sure that when kids are using Google Classroom or whatever online platforms for their interactions, that we're paying attention to the ways that those same technologies can be individually isolating. There's a lot of research out there pointing to the increased loneliness, selfishness, even narcissism that's accompanying the spread of social media and other technologies into our lives. So as we use education, pay close attention to the sort of wholeness of people's needs to support their well-being. Second, to increase public investment in open digital resources, resources that are unbeholden to commercial interests, that are based on a commitment to the common good, and resources that are open in two important respects. One, in terms of access and freely available, but also open to be manipulated, to be adapted, and to be added to and changed by learners. We also, I think, need to, if there's a need for connectivity, and I think there is, clearly we need to close digital divides. We also need to respect non-connectivity, the offline life worlds. We need to ensure that our rush for technological solution doesn't drown out non-digital forms of knowing and learning. The second set of recommendations that I want to put forward is around the principle of centering the most marginalized, right? So clearly we need to close digital divides. We need to enable anytime, anywhere internet access for students and teachers. In doing that, though, we need to commit to safeguarding cultural diversity, to language diversity. We know that connectivity on its own is not going to produce that, but it's going to take a lot of intention and effort and shared work. This is really a call for adopting principles of inclusive design. One of the problems with a lot of innovation in education, but this holds across a lot of areas, is that it's typically designed and tested on a unique profile. Often those who are, already enjoying privilege and advantage, and then it's rolled out and adapted to others. So the call here is to reverse that process and begin with the most vulnerable and the most marginalized situations, with the learners who are most in need of greater opportunities, and then to scale out to more privileged communities. Finally, it's, I think, really important for us to require that technology foremost, as we use it in schools, as we use it outside of schools and in formal and non-formal education, that it serve educational purposes. So the first point is, that is the strong conviction of the Commission that digital technologies cannot and will not should not be allowed to replace schools. That learning cannot be fully displaced into virtual spaces. That is put forward as a lesson of the COVID pandemic. That fully remote online schooling is a poor substitute for the positive learning environments that schools can provide. Second here, that we really need to work on leveraging digital connectivity around enhancing access to knowledge. There's amazing ways that the digital opens up possibilities for teachers and students to access texts, to access artwork, to connect to other kinds of human experiences across the world. And we need to make that the focus of our efforts. Connected with that, digital tools have been very useful as ways to promote communication between teachers, parents, and students, also to bring parents into supporting their children's learning in new ways. We need to remember that alongside the digital being such a valuable communication tool, it's a really valuable creation tool. right? That students can create videos. It's not just a matter of receiving things from the world, but it is a way of enabling people to put things out in the world. Clearly we need strict data protections and to ensure ethical use of AI and algorithms to make sure that, when they bring their predictive models, that's not relying on or reproducing existing stereotypes and systems of exclusion. So I want to close by going back to the call in the Futures of Education report for really centering on education that creates and nurtures possibilities. And the three questions that are put forward, as questions that inspired the Commission's reflections to begin with, inspire the report, but are questions that need to be asked by all of us as we, continue this ongoing collaboration work together. So the first of these is to begin by thinking about what is it that we do in education now that we should continue? What might need to be strengthened or safeguarded, and why? Why are these the important things to keep moving forward? Connected with that is a conversation about what we need to abandon, what we need to move away from, what we might need to unlearn, and why those elements of education, be they practices, policies, or even assumptions, are actually doing us more harm than good. That's an important step towards moving forward. And then finally, taking some time to identify what is it that needs to be really creatively reimagined afresh. And maybe that's something, it's just begins with a process of identifying, hey, we haven't figured out how to do this. It's not something, maybe it'll take 6 months, maybe it'll take 6 years to solve. But these sets of questions, what to continue, what to abandon, and what to reinvent, is the suggestion put forward by the UNESCO Commission on the Futures of Education for best transforming education. And I think they're as applicable to the questions around the digital transformation of education in front of us as they are to other areas. So I'll close with that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Noah. And thank you for foreshadowing the questions that we'll be asking in our small breakout groups, because we did read the report. We were good students and read the report, and we'll go ahead and use those questions for our breakout groups. And it's definitely wonderful to see the connection between Olli-Pekka's presentation and Noah's presentation, which is looking at the challenges as an opportunity to really re-examine what it means to be human. And Olli-Pekka talked about the meta tasks of education, and we are really at a point of thinking about the meta skills of being human, right? And so Olli-Pekka used the idea of the interaction society, and then most likely after the interaction society is the integration society, where all of it comes together, and it's that both and that Noah was getting at, which is the digital and the non-digital knowledge coming together. So excellent. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up with our last speaker, Jane Fleener. Dr. Fleener has had many different experiences throughout her long career. She has studied philosophy, where she focused on alternative logics for artificial intelligence for early computer science applications, taught advanced placement computer science and calculus at the high school level, and was an early adopter of chaos mathematics and complexity theories for education and educational research methods. She began her higher education career as a mathematics teacher educator at the University of Oklahoma. She left Oklahoma University to become dean at Louisiana State University College of Education, and then came to North Carolina State University as dean of their College of Education. Since 2015, when she returned full-time to teaching and research, Dr. Fleener has been working with futurists and community leaders, focusing on developing futures literacy and social transformation for new ways of thinking. Her research spans a variety of fields, including mathematics, mathematics education, teacher in STEM education, adult education, and futures. She has her undergraduate degree in philosophy from Indiana University and 3 graduate degrees from UNC Chapel Hill, including a master's in philosophy, an MAT in mathematics, and a PhD in mathematics education. She is a boundary spanner committed to working across fields for future transformations. Jane?
Thank you so much. And I had forgotten what I had written in my introduction. And it's interesting because I wanted to begin by talking about the fact that I see my presentation as a nice bridge, both from the presentations that have occurred, but then as a bridge to how you change. And so I'm going to be building on some of the themes. And real quickly, I listed some of the words that came out of the 2 previous presentations that are going to be really emergent in my presentation. The issue of hope, by the way, came up actually in someone's self-introduction for the words that they were describing they wanted out of this session. And my presentation is going to talk about hope and heart, and humanity, and coherence, and values, and sustainability, and systems, and transformation, and new social contracts, and ethics, and what it means to be human, and unlearning. And I'm going to be doing that from the perspective of work and identity, and raising the question of how do we change? And I'm going to do that in 15 minutes. I think one of the questions that drives my presentation is who are we? And more importantly, who are we becoming? And, this is in the context of virtual augmented reality, the metaverse, the technological impacts of cybernetics, biometrics, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, nanotechnologies that have changed not only our workplace, but who we are, biomedicine, augmented human. And so as I explore the world of work, it really fundamentally is a question about who we are and where are we going and what is our identity. I build off of the Millennium Project report on the future of work and technology 2050. And so you all have a good reading list from these 3 presentations of the different reports you need to go to. What I like about this report, first of all, it's very comprehensive in the sense that it was a 3-year project. It started out surveying futurists, educators, community leaders, politicians, and asking about the future of work and technology. And then after that, it developed scenarios and it looked at commonalities across 26 countries where they had different people working on scenarios about the future of work. And after they developed the scenarios, they sort of went through it a 3rd time and developed 96 recommendations of, what they projected to be the future of work and technology. The reason I'm talking about the process is I think the process was itself an exciting model of how you involve multiple people across many countries for thinking about some significant topics about the future. I then took the report and looked at it from an educator's perspective to understand the implications of the future of work and technology for education and for learning. And some of the things that were very clear from this report included the fact that meaningfulness is going to become and is already becoming very important for work. Work becoming not just what you do to make a living, but tied to self-actualization. Social contributions increasing in importance, not only from the perspective of meaningfulness of work, but actually getting paid for the kind of work that makes social impact and a difference. Also, I found it very interesting, a lot of emphasis on increase in self-employment. And as an educator, thinking, how do you prepare people not only to assume a role in, the workforce, but how do you prepare people to be self-employed and social entrepreneurs? So the learning needs that all of these results sort of suggest are the need for lifelong learning. And lifelong learning is especially important from the perspective of something called pervasive learning. Pervasive learning is a term that has recently been coined, and it means learning at the speed of need. And I like the flow of that, learning at the speed of need. And that is especially enhanced by the availability of technological resources, but it suggests that our idea of front-loading education and making sure everything is in K-12 education is really disrupted. And it requires different skills than knowing your math and knowing your language arts, but how do you have the learning to learn skills that allow for this pervasive learning to occur? That means much more of an emphasis on the skills needed for informal learning and a de-emphasis on a lot of the skills that are necessary in formal learning. It also means understanding how to use technology and your environment, including other people, for augmented learning. And this is all a part of this emerging world of work where there are increased demands for creativity, collaboration, and flexibility, especially as technology assumes its role in taking away some of the drudgery of the workforce. And so one of my questions as an educator is, how do we prepare for and change our ideas about the world of work? So not just how do we, prepare students, but how do we change in our thinking about the world of work? Another report that I think is relevant here that is something to add to your reading list is the Brookings Institute's report on the future of work in the developing world. And I only mention it here briefly because it brings up many of the ideas in the Millennium Project report about the impact and increased use of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and automation of the workforce. It talks specifically about some of the disruptions of work and work weeks, and even the fact that some people are not going to be working. And, so the role of universal basic income, and then what do you do for people to meaningfully engage when they're no longer having their identities tied to jobs. And so I'll just leave that as something for you to consider. One other thing I want to build on is the idea of how our values are changing. And I really like how Andy Hines in one of his blogs sort of talked about the value changes as a society we're undergoing. We're moving away from the traditional ideas of following the rules and having standard achievement to really these ideas of meaningfulness, value, and then ultimately making a difference. So when you talk about how do you change, I think metaphors are really valuable. And I've spent a long time developing chaos and complexity metaphors. And I remember being challenged once by someone who said, metaphors are only as good as people's experience with the metaphors you present. And so chaos and complexity metaphors weren't working for a lot of people. And so I want to present a metaphor that we're going to build on real briefly called the backwards bicycle. And we all have had experience with bicycles. So I'm going to show you parts of the video.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something. I did something that damaged my mind. It happened on the streets of Amsterdam, and I got really scared, honestly. I can't ride a bike like you can anymore. Before I show you the video of what happened, I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill and I was really proud of it. Everything changed though when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So the faster I go, the better. Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it.
So I'm going to skip ahead here. So he takes this backwards bike on tour, and he shows a lot of different people, trying to learn to ride this backwards bicycle, and they can't do it. They can't unlearn the ideas that they have about how to ride a bike. And so let me move forward to here real quickly.
So here's what I did. It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck. But at least I could ride it. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. That's over half his life. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut. Are you gonna give up?
No.
Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it. Did you see his brain get it? So in how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do, which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult. It's clear from this experiment that children have a much more plastic brain than adults. That's why the best time to learn a language is when you're a young child.
Okay. So you get the idea, and I'm hoping that as you're watching this, you've had times when you've experienced that click where you've changed how you think about something. And my question is, how do you change your ideas about things? And as educators, we dictate the future of education in some respect. We ought to be listening to our kids a little bit more. But one way you do disrupt how you think about anything is by changing your metaphors. And I think there are a lot of social metaphors that need to be changed in order to really have the kinds of changes we need about the future of education that will really prepare people for the kind of workforce and the kind of work they need to have in the future. Because so much of our identity right now is still wrapped up into the work we do. And so the idea that hard work and rugged individualism and work is serious business needs to change. The ideas that success is achievable for all is something that Noah brought up with respect to, we have huge inequities that need to be addressed. And then again, the fact that our identity is so tied up to the work that we do. So not only changing those metaphors, but changing the dominant metaphors in society. And so when we think about the future of education, one thing I appreciate about these conversations that are happening in this convening is that we're looking at these challenges from a social systems perspective. We're looking at them as larger than just an education issue. And so some of the metaphors that we have that dominate the narratives of our society are going to prevent us from having the kind of changes we need in society and with education until we disrupt the ideas that money and power should dictate everything, that science and technology are the only ways to save the planet, that everyone has their place, or that bigger is better. Of course, the bigger is better and growth is unlimited idea. To me, New Zealand is a great example where they have challenged the idea of gross national product as a measure of societal success in favor of the idea of happiness as a measure of societal success. So they're fundamentally trying to change their societal narratives. When we talk about anticipating the future, we often think of it from the perspectives of prediction and optimization. How do we control the future? How do we optimize possibilities for the future? But I think what you've heard in these 3 sessions is also how do we shape the future? How do we create emergent futures? How do we transform society? And what I like to add to all of those futures anticipatory mindsets is what are the ethical reasons for doing so? And what are the underlying ethics? And so that's something that's very important to me. So back to the video that knowledge does not equal understanding. I think as we go into our groups, being able to talk about this from the perspective of knowing that our knowing isn't enough, that we have to have that switch. We have to have that bicycle moment where we unlearn and uplearn in order to really make the kind of changes that need to happen. And so when we think about our educational futures, we can't do that without understanding what our purposes are, who we are going to be in the future, and ultimately even why we exist. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to learning from you in our conversations.
What I appreciate about that presentation is definitely taking on that future orientation perspective. And you asked the question, where are we going? And I think, with the building on the bike metaphor, we can in some ways think about what that process is going to look like for us in the process of where we're going and shaping and co-creating the future, that it's going to be a little bit rocky and we're going to fall and have some spills in the process, but the commitment to really co-shape the future is there, and we can get on the backwards bike and continue to move forward. So I appreciate that. All right, so we're at a point where we'll break into our small breakout groups. Here are the questions for the breakout groups. We'll have 15 minutes together. And first, just take a moment to reflect on the 3 talks that we had today and what resonated with you. So just go around and take a few seconds to just reflect on the 3 talks. And then, as Noah had mentioned, let's start opening up our imaginations for the best possible future. What should we continue doing as we think about moving into the future? And what should we stop doing? Again, what assumptions should we perhaps leave behind? What else should we be leaving behind as we move forward together into the future? And then what needs to be creatively invented afresh? So what are some of the crazy ideas that we can think of as we think about venturing into the future? So we'll go into small breakout groups. And then after that, also make sure that there's somebody who can report out to the larger group. So we'll have report out, and each group will just have 1 minute to share all of the rich conversation that was in the breakout rooms. So we'll have 15 minutes in small groups and then come together as a large group and do a deep dive. We'll go ahead and go around and do a report out. So I'll go first. Our group, Danica, Raul, and Brian. I guess one of the things that we ended on, there was definitely agreement on the need to confront the climate crisis and really looking at incorporating ESG or environmental social governance skills in curriculum. And then also, again, the question of technology and what's that going to look like as part of education, and also taking on a global perspective within the curriculum or in education as well. So that was a couple key points that from our group. Who would like to go next?
Well, I did group 2, so we'll do, and I forgot to say who wants to volunteer to do it until the very end when everyone was bailing out on me. So I'll do a real quick. The idea of adaptiveness came up as an important skill and something that those of us who are here are actually representing. Also the idea of systems, and that pockets of innovation are not enough. In order to really change, we need to change systems. Changing mindsets and culture was an important theme that came up as well, that, the practices and the formats and so forth aren't enough. We talked a little bit about leadership and the interpersonal development, the ability to work across, different cultures and ideas and people and spaces. And that unfortunately for our children in schools, their first leadership examples in the classroom with teachers are very autocratic models of leadership. And so changing leadership models and includes even what it looks like when we implement those changes in the classroom. We talked briefly about cognitive, social, and emotional development, and the idea of changing hearts and minds really resonated, that it's more than just, technical interests. And we ended with a note of optimism. And I always appreciate when we can end with a note of optimism.
Excellent.
So I'm going to go next. Our group decided that we should keep the physical connection, the group learning, the group interaction, literacy building. And our group was composed of Gayatra, Lalo, and Rudy, and me. We should abandon the rigid curricula, and instead we should create a more adaptive, agile programs that would allow students to learn in a more diverse environment. It should be flexible learning, enjoyable learning, and the class distribution, the student-teacher ratio should be changed based on these new designs.
We had Yelena, Jose, Sangeeta, and Asaya in our group. Number 3, we spent a lot of time just talking to each other, introducing each other, which was phenomenal, very, very rich experience. And I think that everything was sort of filtered through, the new information was filtered through that experience that we personally brought to this conversation. And some of the highlights were around the importance of learning throughout your life cycle. And specifically, Jose brought up the idea that we get to coaching, that was Yelena, we get to coaching much later in life. No one is starting their career by being a coach. And so where coaching comes in and what the role of coaching is in this shifting learning environment. And then Sangeeta, among other things, she's the school principal, talked about the importance of ethics and humanity in teaching any curriculum. So that ethical thinking was kind of a running thread through our conversation.
So our general theme was, there's a need for change. We cannot prepare our youth to thrive in the 21st century if we continue down the same path. We really brought out the two fundamental roles of education. It's an intergenerational conversation where we transfer the human achievements of the past generation to the next, and then prepare their capacity to face the future. And as society continues to change, what are the most important things to cultivate within individuals? Many students in school right now will work a job that does not yet exist. So the question is, what do we need to focus on? And the future is integration. It's about the technological, humanity, and ecological interdependence. Thought also needs to be given to the guidelines, the ethical guidelines, paying attention to who are the stakeholders, what are their incentives, and making sure that those are aligned to the flourishing of students, not just their bottom line. And additionally, there's a need to address the past while transforming the future. We need to also consider the most marginalized populations as we experiment, and not just test the average and try to force fit into the so-called crevices of society to make sure that there's an ethical future.
I had the privilege of having David, Nikolibi, and Ananya, hope I pronounced your names correctly. It was a lovely discussion. We looked at the uneven distribution of digital technology in particular, and the focus on ensuring equality of provision, and also that, on the technology side, that it is a mode of delivery. It's not the pure content. We should really, put our focus on the content, not just on the delivery unit itself. And something that resonated was the substitution of machines for human decision making. And that really, when we're looking at universal concerns, that this transcends areas of faith, of culture, and really to bring this together. The idea is to form a deeper connection and less automation. And something else that we came up with is that, technology being a tool and not just a solver of all challenges in education, it can be a very positive tool, but not to see that it has all the answers. And, not to do the same thing repeatedly the same way. Another thing that resonated was that, tasks are not to be respond, but actually to be reshaped. And an area that we thought was highly relevant is the reintroduction or re-stressing of EQ, of emotional intelligence in schools, and adding that, automation, shouldn't be at the expense of empathy in schools and relationships. And looking at the human engagement factor, that should be recreated and built upon through student voice, for example, and also through teacher voice as well. Something we related to in the pandemic is that, by giving teachers much more empowerment of their voice, they could actually make very worthwhile practical decisions in the classroom and re-engage with families and children's in their homes. And so giving teacher a real voice and giving students a real voice in the schools actually creates a lot of empowerment and also a lot of ownership as well.
It was very easy to change the world in 15 minutes. Yeah, and some ideas that we talk about. Brian, for example, talked about having more collaboration between all the parts in the system, working together. We need to work together for getting solutions. Stephanie talked about how we could learn from others, from other reports, from other sectors, from other lessons learned in solving problems in other industries or in other activities. Cordy talked about if we are talking about a new social contract, we should take in account all the parts for that contract. For example, the students in that way. Only remember us that this is a system. So the first thing we need is to trust in the system. Yeah, we need to trust in the system for getting solutions. And I was talking about what we could recover from the past. I talk about the need of our students to get more orientations because they are lost. So we need to accompany them with that old figure of the tutor, someone who is going in the path with the students and is trying to guide. Yeah, and sometimes we need more horizontal work with them, not so hierarchical, not so focused on contents, but focus on accompanying someone in the way. Yeah, and that was my idea to the group number 7. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I am looking at time, mindful of time, and we won't necessarily get into a deep dive. So I think at this point, it's just a matter of picking up on what has surfaced and where do we want to go next, right? And so the questions that we had, what do we want to take forward? What do we want to leave behind? And what do we want to create afresh? So as we, manifest the hope, the learning, the connection here in the room, the Zoom room, I'm curious, where do you see the next step for yourself after the conversations today? What is the next step for you? What are you inspired to do? So international collaboration of educators to bring out change. There was, yes, in our group, reach more universities around the world to work on climate change.
May I speak if it's fine?
Yes.
My name is Ananya Mehta. I'm pursuing my MBA at Shalini University. And there's this program in a university that's We Empower. It's related to coaching. And that is how I got exposed to this new environment, so to say, and therefore attending this session. So I feel that coaching is something that we should definitely punch in more in our system, because since I've had my coaching sessions and since I've been exposed to coaching, my life has completely transformed. But there's a lot of stigma and a lot of skepticism, so to say, around coaching, because now that I've experienced coaching, I define it as something that brings out the super you. It helps you bring about it helps you manifest the superpower that is somewhere hidden inside, but it's not, there yet. And when I was exposed to coaching, I was able to introspect much more and, garner the answers by myself. And that gave me a sense of power. And I, on a personal level, with the help of my guides here in Shalini, I try to, update people more about coaching. And, I've also introduced a lot of my friends to coaching, and they are seeing a lot of difference. So I think coaching is something that I would love to work more upon and bring it, much more into the awareness, especially amongst the students.
Thank you. So it sounds like coaching is a tool that you see as something to bring forward into the future. What other tools do people see bringing into the future, or what other tools do you see leaving behind, or assumptions that we need to leave behind? Elena, Espinal, I saw that your hand was up.
Yes, thank you. Just to share a thought, probably we name coaching to a profession and a kind of conversation, but we can also see how powerful is this model, this paradigm of seeing possibility, of assisting other in conversations to see possibility, and how this could help to change a lot of our kind of relationships in the world, even the relationship with future. So being more responsible of the future we are creating. So probably we have to include in this expansion how this kind of conversations, I don't want to call this like coaching, but the kind of conversations that coaching brings to other environments in our lives.
Great, thank you. Atul?
Yeah, one of the major takeaways and initiative that I am thinking in my mind after this wonderful discussion is to really get some of the young educators in India together to collaborate for change. Because I think as Dr. Feener just put it, age is one of the big detrimentals to adopt change. So if we can, this is what we are going to be trying. I mean, just thought this came in, that if we could get the young educators to spearhead a change movement in a country like India, which has about 1.5 million schools, then I think that may be one of the way forward. We'll try it out and see how it happens, and maybe share it with you guys if we succeed in that.
So really picking up on the theme of collaboration is running throughout the conversation today. And I definitely invite each of you to find ways to collaborate with one another. This is a group of people who share a passion for transforming education. And one of the things I'll just allude to as our call to action to the group is we'll, after this convening, ask for volunteers from this group to come together to create a manifesto based on what was discussed today. And that manifesto would be just a document that we can share with educational stakeholders across the world to endorse or pledge and use a coaching lens. You don't have to be a coach to participate in that task force, but we'll definitely make sure that there's a couple coaches to be part of that conversation to look at coaching as a tool, as Anya mentioned, that we can bring forward into the future of education. And I know that Tom had mentioned a little bit about the program at Rice, and I see Tim just also talked about EPOG Academy. So Tom, did you want to share?
Well, sure. For the last 5 years, we've been providing professional leadership coaches from the ICF to about 800 students a year, coached in the context of what they're passionate about. So an engineering student is coached in the context of an engineering project. A cellist is coached in the context of the quartet or the orchestra. And we've seen whopping shifts. I mean, we have a team of psychologists who measure the outcomes of this, and it's been a powerful change creator at Rice. Tim Harrison is a product of that program, and not only was coached himself, but he's learned to be a coach. And so we are very open. We share everything. We share our data. We share our business models. We share our practices and approaches. And we're happy to respond to queries from anyone.
Thank you. Raul? I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Alicia. I was now writing something about metared.org. This is an experience of university of our company, and we have gathered more than 1,200 CIOs of universities to face the problems of the pandemic of COVID-19. And this is an example of how collaborative groups really work. We have been scouting the best experiences to face these problems from the digital transformation point of view. We have shared them, and we have created different collaborative groups in order to spread these best practices of other universities. This is for a scope of Latin American universities in the countries where the university has a footprint and presence. And perhaps one thing that we can share is the possibility of joining as many universities as possible as you want, or people from this meeting to know more about this experience, and of course to join this group of collaborative initiatives.
Great. Excellent. So we're also in the chat talking about the student and focusing on the student. Danuka talked about focusing on the student and the learner in our education, and also Arturo focusing on the teacher. So that brings us back to the type of relationships that we want to be creating, right? And what type of relationships do we need to create anew, as far as relationships for teachers, relationships for students, relationships between teachers and students, relationships with ourselves, and relationships with the planet. So what do those new relationships look like? What type of relationship are we trying to create? And I think we've been getting around the collaboration and the connectivity and the global perspective themes here today. So what other type of relationships come to mind for you when thinking about the future of education? What are important relationships that we need to consider and build?
Alicia, it's Tony McKay. I think the starting point of this conversation that Olli-Pekka positioned, namely that this is not just a conversation for the elite. This is requiring a level of public engagement. And I thought, as Noah was presenting, the notion of a new social contract, and Jane going right through to the point where this will require a level of self-actualization, demands a different system to support the kind of learning we're talking about. If we're all saying that learners are at the center of this endeavor, and learners' interests and passions and purpose is at the center of this endeavor, then you need to have a system that actually supports them, that's an ally to their learning. I think that's a big shift. You know, we've been talking about the system and saying that it'll require shifts in practice, it'll require shifts in structures, and we're saying it requires shifts in mindset. Well, we've tended to say in the past, I think, that this means we need levels of public awareness, we need levels of professional engagement, we need all of the stakeholders involved, and we need political will. What we're also saying here is that at the heart of this entire enterprise are learners themselves. And they are demanding, and by the way, they are demanding that we reconfigure the system in order that they can pursue those passions, to be clear about what their identity will be, to understand their purpose, and to make a contribution to humanity and to a sustainable future. If we do not get ourselves in a position where the social contract is with those young people, their families and their communities, if we can't figure out how to reconfigure the system, in the way in which I think this conversation has suggested, we will not get transformation. And I think that if this conversation doesn't engage with learners, families and communities, and brings around that the political and the public in what then would be a new social contract, Noah, it's got to be at a different level, I think, than the way in which many of the conversations take place. I think this conversation has been embracing that. So it would be great if, as we take forward the dialogue, we understand who is going to be part of that social contract, right? Where does the authorization and legitimization for the shift in the system lie? And how do we as leaders support that process?
I will have a question, and I know that we just have 2 minutes. And this question is for Ollie. And Ollie, if you can answer it in just 30 seconds, that would be excellent. But we have here a great group of leaders. I am thinking about when we go back to our organizations, we really want to make a change. So in your opinion, what should be the first step that we have to take in order to begin a change?
That's not an easy question to answer in 30 seconds. But I think that it's the kind of two things. The kind of connection. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the same way, we should be thinking also that what are our internal development goals as humans, and understand that those two things are very strongly interlinked. That kind of our growth, our well-being is actually the same thing as the global growth in a positive way of the word growth, and the planetary well-being. And the other one is that what needs to happen that we can get that connection to come through is the trust element. Is constantly, when we're talking about learning system, learning is a trustful relation. And in order to make the transformation happen that Tony was talking about, really moving to a next level, we have to create the basis for that, and that requires the trust to be there.
Thank you.
I see Tim and Lalo, your hands are up, but I'm not sure we'll have time to get to you. So I invite you to share your comments that we can share among the group to keep the conversation going. As I mentioned, this is an opportunity for us to start a conversation for collaboration and continue from here. And we'll send out an email with follow-up information and call to action to participate in creating that manifesto, which I think is really, Anthony, thank you for posing some of those questions that I think the task force for the manifesto can consider when shaping that manifesto, that it's really including many people in the conversation, teachers, students, parents, the community, along with all of the administrators, policymakers, et cetera. So it's public and private coming together. And, Olli-Pekka talked about the interaction society, and really it is moving towards that integration society. And in order to develop the interconnectedness that we're talking about here. So with that, I really thank you for your time today. I'm so very grateful to have the opportunity to share this time with you, and we'll send some follow-up information and definitely just continue to do what you're doing. The path forward and the future is bright with people who have the hope and the inspiration and innovation here in this Zoom room today. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again.